Great. I think we are good to start as people continue to join us. Just going to kick off the webinar. A very, very warm welcome to all participants joining us for our webinar on exploring outcomes-based financing in education. We are really thrilled to have you with us here today. For those of you who may not know about Global Schools Forum, GSF is a collaborative community and innovation accelerator and a partnership builder for non-state actors working to improve education at scale in low and middle income countries. Currently, we have 162 organizations that are part of this network, working across 64 countries, impacting over 1.2 million children directly and 121 million children indirectly through our education support organizations. The organizations in the GSF community are standalone schools, school networks, and ECD centers working within or across countries, and organizations providing core support services to non-state schools and to government education systems. In our previous webinars, we launched our Evidence Hub on government and non-state partnerships and spoke about the importance of partnership and strategies to initiate new partnerships in education. The Evidence Hub was developed as a knowledge base to help both governments and non-state actors understand the breadth of possible partnerships and help develop and create sustainable, impactful partnerships. The Hub is a repository of tools and resources, which includes toolkits, global case studies, policy briefs, and a partnership framework to support sustainable, outcome-driven partnerships. In today's session, we are delving deeper into outcome-based financing mechanism, which we have also explored in our Hub. Our expert panel today will speak about the design, challenges, and benefits and future potential of innovative financing mechanisms through their combined knowledge and experience in low and middle income country contexts. A few housekeeping pointers before we jump in. This webinar is being recorded. We will be able to share a link with you after the event is complete. Please share any questions you might have through the chat or the Q&A option at the bottom of your screens. We will pose it to the panelists during the Q&A session post the panel discussion. With that out of the way, I would like to introduce our wonderful moderator, Juanita. Juanita is the program manager at the Education Outcomes Fund, where she has been managing the implementation of the Sierra Leone Education Innovation Challenge for the last 2.5 years. She has been working in the design and implementation of result-based financing programs for over 6 years in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, which means that all of you are in great hands today. Without further ado, I now hand over to Juanita. Thank you. Juanita, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Tejaswini, and welcome everyone. Very excited for the discussion that we're about to have. So as the name of the webinar says, we're going to explore outcomes-based financing in education. So before I introduce our exceptional panelist, I want to put us all in context of what that means. So results-based financing, outcomes-based financing is a mechanism in which instead of paying for activities like delivering books or trainings, we pay for outcomes like learning gains. It can take many different forms or shapes, but I'm going to quickly go through 5 main actors who take part in this type of mechanism. So one is implementing partners, the ones who are on the ground and being incentivized for the achievement of outcomes. Then they usually get support from impact investors who provide upfront capital to then get repaid after the outcomes are achieved. Outcomes payers who, as its name says, pay for outcomes achieved, and that's usually could be either just a group of donors or a mix between donors and government. And then also usually, especially outcomes funds, have an intermediary, which basically is a middle person who makes sure that all the different parties are collaborating effectively. And then lastly, we have an independent evaluator who basically measures and verifies the results. So that's just quickly to put us in context of what we're talking about here. And then our panelists, we're going to give a lot more color to what that means in practice. But before I pass it on to you to present each of the different programs you're working on, I want to introduce, quickly give an introduction of each of you. So Jemima, who is joining as a senior advisor in the FCDO's impact investment team. There she leads all the work related to outcomes-based financing, and she also has 10 years of experience in the UK department working on development, trade, and economic diplomacy. We also have Anushree joining from the British Asian Trust, where she's an associate director and leads their social finance work in India. She brings 15 years of experience in corporate social responsibility, public policy, and not-for-profit sectors in both India and the UK. And then as well, George Abu Foday, who's a co-founder and program manager of the National Youth Awareness Forum in Sierra Leone. And he has been working in education programs for over 20 years. And his organization is participating in the Sierra Leone Education Innovation Challenge and Outcomes Fund that I also work at in Sierra Leone. So with that, we have a lot of wealth of experience here from all of you. So very excited to delve into the different details and insights that you'll bring on how these mechanisms work. But before we go into that, I would love for all of the three of you to quickly introduce the work that you've been doing in each of your organizations. So I'll pass it first to you, Anushree, if you can tell us a bit more of the Quality Education India dip and the Lift dip.
Thanks, Juanita, and thank you for having me here. Super excited to share our insights and learnings, and a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for your enthusiasm and excitement. I think 80 in the days when webinars now seem passé is a pretty impressive number. So thank you for the interest. Very quickly, so BAT, or the British Asian Trust, pioneered outcomes-based financing in the South Asia region around 8 years ago. And in these 8 years, we have now facilitated or anchored 3 development impact bonds in India. 2 of these development impact bonds have been in the education space, and 1 has been in the employment sector. So I'll focus on the 2 in the education space. So as Juanita said, 1 is called the Quality Education India Development Impact Bond. Sorry, it's quite a mouthful. I'll call it QEI. And the other one is called Lifted. QEI ran for 4 years from 2018 to 2022. It was a $10 million outcome fund, a development impact bond. It had 4 implementation partners with 4 slightly different models of education. We were focused on grades 1 to 8, and the final outcome that we were measuring and paying for was learning outcomes. And we had, of course, a verifier, again, like as Vinata explained, for a third party assessment of these learning outcomes. We had a group of partners on there. So I'll just kind of give you a sense of the key ones. The investor who gives the upfront working capital to the implementation partner for QEI was UBS Optimus Foundation. And on the outcome funder side, we had Michael and Suzel Dell Foundation and a group of 3 or 4 more UK-based individuals and foundations. This bond wrapped up in 2022, and we saw some fantastic results. So 2 out of the 4 years of this bond were actually during the COVID-19 pandemic. So India saw some of the longest school closures in the world. And we actually ran this bond through that without pausing, without sort of course, pivoted, but did not change our outcome targets, did not change our outcome metrics. And I'm very glad to share that at the end of 4 years, the treatment group, which is the group of students who were part of the development impact bond, learned 2.5 times more than the control group, which were basically children and schools were not part of this bond, right? So just very sort of, I think this was the first impact bond in education that was done at scale, building on the Educate Girls impact bond, which was the first impact bond in world for education. Building on the learnings of QEI impact bond, we launched Lifted impact bond last year in January. There were 2 learnings that we had from the QEI impact bond. One is that I should have said this. QEI impact bond basically covered 200,000 children, which by itself is a decent scale, but given India's kind of scale, it's still a drop in the ocean. So our first learning from the QEI impact bond is that we need to scale. And for scale, we need to think about our cost per outcome very, very carefully. And that the level of scale that we were seeking in India would not come without the government. And that was a second learning. In QEI, we did not have very active participation of the government. Of course, they were engaged and involved, but not proactive. And so the second learning we had is that we have to involve government. The Lifted impact bond that we launched last year, that was a $14 million impact bond, aiming to reach 1.5 million children over 4 years. And there, what we have done differently, we again have 4 implementation partners on ground. And what we're doing differently is we're focusing on indirect interventions or systems change interventions. So we're not delivering education services directly in schools to children, but we're rather working with our partners to change some of the government systems and how education is delivered. And this focuses on FLN, or foundational literacy and numeracy, which is grades 1 to 4 in India. I will talk about government a little later, but for now, I think I'll hand it back to you, Juanita. I think that's good enough sort of a background to the lifted and QEI bonds.
Thanks a lot, Anushree. Very interesting, and looking forward to understanding more of all the insights that you got from those 2 experiences. So now I'll pass it on to George to tell us a bit more about the Sierra Leone Education Innovation Challenge.
Yeah. And thanks, my colleagues, everyone. And it's a pleasure to be part of the discussion. I may speak a little bit on that. The Sierra Leone Education Innovation Challenge project, normally we call it SLEIC, was actually born out of the government of Sierra Leone's desire to transform the primary education to give the skill that the children need that will boost their learning outcome in literacy and numeracy, actually. It's clear that we have had a very struggling education system over the years, and so government is trying to see what we can do with partners' intervention in the education sector to improve that. And so in 2022, we have the largest outcome fund education. It's about $18 million launch in Sierra Leone in partnership with the Education Outcome Fund and the other co-funders. The project actually intended to reach 134,000 children in the 325 primary schools across Sierra Leone. And that project, we have 5 dedicated partners, which we all have a common goal, but with some slight approaches in terms of how we can really improve learning outcomes in literacy and numeracy. In that, we have Rise in the Academy, we have Educate, we have NAP in partnership with Kizazi, Street Child, and Save the Children. We all have flexible intervention to be able to see how we can contribute to increasing children learning outcomes. Maybe I might quickly take you through what are some of the key features really of the outcome model that we are implementing. One is that it is a government that identifies the schools and set clear learning targets based on the national curriculum. It's government because the project is implemented in public schools, government-assisted school, we call in our context here. And then together, government and the Education Outcome Fund, in this context, EOF, they are the ones that select the partner that will and also oversee the implementation. I might talk a little detail later in terms of how was that done actually. And then the implementing partner, secure social investor. This is one key area in the model where the social investors, we, the service provider, implementing partners, we are the ones that have to look for an investor that will pre-fund our program. So that's one key area. And also partners are reimbursed by the outcome funders based on their success in achieving the goals, or maybe specific measurable outcomes that agree with the partners in the program. For SLEIC, we agreed on performance band B. The other critical element of the outcome funding we are dealing with has sustainability built in. There is a price cap in terms of minimum cost per child. For the SLEIC, we have $36 per child. Maybe it has its own implication in terms of compromising quality with cost, but because this is a project which government wants to scale up nationally, so they must have a cost that they are able to accommodate for scaling. And then lastly, the program is independently evaluated. For this context, we have OPM, Oxford Policy Management. They are doing the evaluation independently. It will surprise you if I can share 2 years after some of the key results that we are able to create an impact based on OPM year 2 evaluation report. One is that the math scores increased by 0.292 standard deviation, surpassing the stretch target of 0.24. And the English scores rose by 0.175 standard deviation, which is very strong progress from the previous year 1 baseline results. And also, we also saw that the year 2 result also showed how the program has closed the learning gender gap from baseline to year 2 by 73% in maths. And also in year 2, we were able to deliver significant improvement in learning outcomes for children in the treatment schools. As mentioned earlier, we have the treatment group and we have the control group. So our impact is assessed, or our efficacy is determined by the difference between the treatment and the intervention schools. And lastly, we also saw an attendance rate for students and for teachers were higher in the treatment school than the control school. We are currently in the Q2 in year 3 implementing this project, and we look forward to sharing other exciting impact as we go along. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, George. Super interesting. And then I'll pass it lastly to Jemima, who's also involved in the Sierra Leone Education Innovation Challenges, as FCDO is the main anchor funder. But we know that FCDO is involved in a lot of other different programs in outcomes-based financing. So if you want to tell us a bit about that.
Thanks, Juanita, and thanks for inviting me to join this panel. It's great to be here virtually. It's great to see some familiar faces on the line and also many new ones. As you said, FCDO is involved in a number of initiatives on outcomes-based financing, and like British Asian Trust, we've really been here from the beginning, I think it's fair to say, and a lot of what we have done over the last nearly 10 years on outcomes-based financing internationally has been informed by our experience using outcomes-based financing in the UK domestically as well. So we're really trying to do 3 things. Firstly, to deploy and test outcomes-based financing at scale in low and middle income countries. And that's across a number of sectors. So how we do this is we come in as an outcomes funder and we commit significant sums of outcomes funding to programs that are using an outcomes-based financing mechanism at scale. And of course, as we've already mentioned, we're the main outcomes funder for the Sierra Leone Education Innovation Challenge. We are also the main outcomes funder for the Ghana Education Outcomes Project, which also involves Education Outcomes Fund. But we're working in other sectors as well: clean cooking, sexual health and reproductive rights, and various others. And while we're really trying to encourage scale here, so we focus most of our funding on a small number of programs, but coming in as a large outcomes funder, we do also support design and smaller pilots that have the potential to grow as well. Second thing, we're trying to help build the outcomes-based financing ecosystem. So we support the Outcomes Accelerator, which is a smaller seed funding platform, together with UBS Optimus Foundation and the Swiss government. We support the Outcomes Finance Alliance, which is a network organization for those who are interested in outcomes-based financing. And we've been doing some work with the OECD on developing principles for good outcomes-based financing in international development. And finally, linked to that, we support the development of knowledge and evidence around outcomes-based financing. And we're particularly interested in building evidence for how outcomes-based financing can represent good value for money for outcomes funders. So that's it from us. Juanita, back to you.
Great, thank you. Super interesting. A lot to dive into, more insights and experiences for everyone attending here to learn. So yeah, I want to start with like some specific questions that I have for each of you based on your experience. So I'll start with George. So yeah, George is the sort of like implementing partner representative in this group. I want to understand a bit more. Sort of like how was the process of applying to be part of an outcomes fund? What were like any challenges, or like what did you learn on that process? And also similarly, like with what you know right now, what would you have liked to know back when you started and when you decided to embark in participating in an outcomes fund?
Thank you, Anita. It's a very pragmatic question. Yes, maybe to start with that, we first now participated in the Education Innovation Challenge program, which gave birth to SLAEIC. And we, being the only locally led organization, participated in that from 2019 to 2022. And it started before the SLAEIC, we jointly, that is NAP and Kizazi in partnership, we developed the expression of interest. And after that, because outcome-based funding requires social investor, so after our expression of interest, we have to engage our donor, the Rockley Foundation, to be able to put trust in our capacity to support that. And we were able to get in touch with that. And then we jointly applied Kizazi and NAF for the course of proposal for that. We went through the rigorous due diligence process. I think I might discuss on that a bit, very little. And then we went through, after that the due diligence process, we got selected as one out of the 5 organizations and the only locally led organization among the others. We also went through the launch, which we had in June 2022. And we had the program implemented in phases. We have the pre-intervention activity, which began in July to August 2022. And we actually started intervention in September 2022. Currently, we are in the second quarter in year 3. Maybe the most challenging aspect I might want to share in the process was the due diligence. Government EOF actually did extensive due diligence based on programmatic, based on monitoring and evaluation, talking about financial management, child safeguarding, intensive safeguarding, and some other processes. But we are only able to overcome that organization through strategic partnership with Kizazi. And also we have some internal strategic review of our own system and processes, at least to be able to meet the expectations. What we learned actually from now to this process was that the power of strategic partnership. That we learned that whatever as a small organization, we partner with our Kizazi partner to be able to meet the expectations of the outcome funding, and learning also what to do with peer learning and collaboration. I think we are all having a common goal, but with different approaches. So we have the expectation, we have the opportunity to be able to learn and share with a platform that has to do with partner sharing the best practices and learning from that, and we are able to replicate that. So effectively, we internally meet at each level to be able to share our learnings. And one most important thing is that we learn also to focus enough to become a highly result-oriented organization. At least the outcome fund had able to help us. For example, we have to review our intentions. We have to review our priorities based on both internal data and external data to be able to refocus ourselves in terms of how we can be able to really create the impact that is required based on what the data speaks to us. And then we also have distributed leadership in terms of all those who matter, how can we really bring them on board, hence an outcome-based program to ensure that we get the desired look. On the other hand, we are also looking at what is it that we really have liked to have known before we start outcome-based funding. One is that the minimum standard for intervention school to be agreed. Because the control schools and the intervention schools, it is the margin of impact between these two that actually shows the efficacy of our impact. So we really wish that that standard of minimum standard we are to agree on, for example, could be teachers or the on-ground realities of the intervention school through a verification process to be able to discern exactly how our model could be able to work, because we are working with structured pedagogy. And then the measures also to be able to control schools to determine how control really they are because there are incidences we have prior implementation that also have to affect the impact. And the sustainability plan in terms of at the ministry, how can we really be able to scale up the intervention at national level? As an organization, what we have really wanted maybe to have done, to keep us in a better position for outcome funding has to do with to strengthen our capacity gaps that we are really identified during the due diligence process, safeguarding, monitoring, at least to have put us in the better position for any competitive outcome-based funding so far. I think I might want to stop here so far, maybe. I think we may have any other questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, George. Super interesting. And that's a perfect segue to hear from you, Anushree. So as George was saying, going through this process, especially for implementing partners, can sometimes be challenging, changing sort of the mindsets that's required for an outcomes fund. So I want to hear from, your experience working more as in the intermediary, working closely with those implementing partners, but with all the other actors involved in this. Yeah, how do you manage those relationships in the best way, and how do you sort of like ensure that there's an effective partnership across all the different actors?
Right. I could probably go on for hours. I'll try and kind of keep it really short. I think there are three things, Juanita, that I want to emphasize, right? One is especially the context of many developing countries, especially sort of, including but not limited to India. We see that there is a trust deficit, right? So outcome funders don't trust implementation partners don't trust government doesn't trust anyone. And so you go on and on about that. And when you are designing in an environment of trust deficit, what we've actually found is that impact bonds are a great instrument, because by design, these instruments actually encourage more transparent communication, transparent sharing of outcomes. And the governance of it is also quite transparent, right? So one is that a tool like impact bond itself comes with some of these elements that help in fostering that trust. Having said that, that only happens when you convince people in the first place to come and be part of the impact bond, right? So that handholding, especially for first-time participants, whether it's the outcome funder from a private sector or even an implementation partner, requires a lot of support, a lot of sort of, awareness building, but I would also say a lot of co-creation. And that's where sort of, the dilemma comes, because the minute you start, so I'll give you an example from Lifted. In Lifted Impact Bond, we are close to around 12 plus partners, right? Now, imagine if we were trying to co-create and co-design with all of them, and we were co-creating and co-designing all elements, it would directly impact the transaction, the design time and cost for this, the go-to-market time for this, right? Having said that, I think we did sort of create space for co-designing, especially with implementation partners. And I think that's quite unusual and atypical, right? Normally, the commissioner of an impact bond or an outcomes fund would say, here's the term sheet, here are the outcomes, and then go to the market. Right now, India's not at that stage where people will buy off the term sheet. So for the implementation partners, especially on outcome measurement, and I've put a long answer in the Q&A box, but that was one area where we definitely involved and co-created the outcomes measurement, the outcomes framework with the implementation partners, allowing that trust to be built, allowing that power dynamics, which a typical grant arrangement between a donor and donee has, to shift a little bit, because we're working with 4 largest, most experienced education providers and partners in the country, right? So one is allow for co-creation and co-design, but do it in a way where you don't end up taking 4 years to design something before launching. So that was our second learning and the second way we managed this. The third interesting point around this is, just like I was saying, because of that trust deficit, having a neutral party helps, because what it allows us to do is we have a 360-degree view of everything that everyone is feeling. So we're the brokers, right? And I know that, sort of involvement of intermediaries meets with mixed response at times, because yes, it does come with a cost, right? But I almost think that it's cost of doing business in emerging markets, because the markets themselves are not at that point where, you can sort of expect very lean transactions, right? So the fact that we were there in the middle, we knew what the outcome funders wanted, we knew what the investor was thinking, we knew what the challenges our evaluators were pointing out in some of these demands, and we knew what the implementation partners were feeling through the investor, allowed us to basically create a fit for purpose thing, right? It wasn't ideal, there were compromises, and the negotiation of this, the consensus building for 12 parties to say, yes, these are the 4 outcome indicators, yes, these are the targets, yes, these are the payment terms, required brokering. But the fact that, our loyalty or our accountability was to the outcome and to the transaction helped to kind of do that. And the last piece in all of this was the role of government, right? So as I was sort of alluding to, while India's done very large scale impact bonds, we yet have to see government's participation as an outcome funder or as a commissioner. We haven't been able to kind of do that or unlock that. And there are many reasons around it, and I won't go into it. But the one thing that we've done innovatively in Lifted, but in also a skill impact bond, is we've rethought of government's participation and created a pathway. Instead of just saying, you have to be an outcome funder, which means that they essentially go back and change their procurement systems, they change their audit systems, they change their regulatory framework for a lot of this. We said, okay, we understand this is going to take time. Can we gently create the pathway? So in the skill impact bond, there is a semi-government body that acts as an investor, right? And we're now talking to them to say, look, guys, you've done this. You've been the investor. You've done the performance management. You know what the risks and returns are. You know what the opportunities are. Can you now mainstream this and become an outcome funder, right? So there was a step change to say, okay, you're an investor. You have had ringside view of this, very close to the operations. Now you're convinced of this value. Can you think of becoming outcome funder? In the lifted impact bond, it sounds very strange to say this, but in a way, government is a beneficiary, right? Because we're working on systems change interventions, what we are saying is the government in India already has a very big mission around FLN, which is the Nipun Bharat mission. So we want to get to universal FLN by, say, 2026, 27, right? Call to action has been given out. There is a rallying sort of force in galvanizing the private sector, the civil society to work around this. But the devil is always in the detail. So what we've done is we've said, okay, we're going to use the Nipun Bharat framework. Our interventions will speak to some of your outcomes that you've articulated there, but let us come and work with you at a local level to augment your capacity, right? We don't want to do this in parallel because that's not sustainable. That won't yield long-term impact. So we work at a regional level with regional governments in 4 states, and our partners actually go and sit with these state actors or government officials, and they try to shift their thinking from administrators to educators, right? That shift is critical because today when government looks at education budgets, they look at delivery of education, they're thinking textbooks, they're thinking benches, they're thinking infrastructure, they're thinking, has the budget been spent? They are not saying, okay, how are you doing on FLN? Where is your data? What is your assessment looking like? Am I being a good mentor to these teachers? It is part of their work. It's just that they don't have the resources, the capability. The resources, budgets are there. It's the capability, right? No one's ever come to them and said, okay, this is how you look at data, right? Like this is what your data trends are showing. This is the competency that's probably falling behind. So that's a theory of change with Lifted, where from a partnership perspective, to work with the government, we've started down this road to say, we'll work with you, we'll augment your system, and we're going to pay on those outcomes. So we pay on learning outcomes, yes, for sure, but we also pay on system shift indicators. We measure them annually through a third-party verifier, and we actually pay on these, right? So just sort of 3 big points to say: address the trust deficit, co-create, but do it in a way where you're not increasing your transaction cost or your design time. And then think a little bit outside the box for stakeholders such as government, which may be a bit slow to move. The intent is there, but the pathways need to be created. Back to you, Juanita.
Thanks a lot. Super interesting, especially as our role at EOF as intermediaries, a lot there to learn from. But yeah, I want to now ask Jemima, sort of like we've heard a bit of how this has worked, but also in your work with FCDO, working in a lot of different mechanisms. How do you see this is evolving, and how do you see the role of outcomes funds sort of like evolving in the future? What are the main innovations you're seeing, and yeah, what do you think should be the role sort of like as we move forward?
Thanks, Juanita. Firstly, I'd say it's a really great moment to be asking that question. As we've heard so far, there have been lots of really interesting initiatives in this space going back nearly 10 years. We've seen the development from development impact bonds, smaller scale projects, through to larger outcomes funds. And personally, I think the year 2 results from the Sierra Leone Education Outcomes Fund that George explained, I think that those results are a really significant milestone, showing us that this outcomes fund structure at a larger scale than just an individual impact bond, it can work. Learning is possible. It can focus stakeholders on learning outcomes, forge that partnership between government, donors, and NGOs, and drive better application of existing learning interventions that we know work. So the question for us all now is, where next? If we think it's worked in Sierra Leone, what now? And for us in FCDO, we think about 2 different things here. Firstly, how can we scale the individual outcomes funds further? How can we go from hundreds of thousands to multiples of that in terms of students that are actually achieving learning outcomes through these structures? And for us as an outcomes funder, it's really key that we start to develop a deeper understanding of the value for money of these approaches compared to traditional input-based models, and what that value for money looks like as we increase the scale. Can we increase the scale while not increasing the costs in a linear way, and therefore get better and better value for money? And I know that that's work that's already starting up within Education Outcomes Fund and with other partners. So we're very excited to understand that analysis better. And I think we're beginning to see lots of good ideas about how we can do that scaling in a really cost-efficient way. Measurement of outcomes is a big piece there. How can we measure outcomes really cost efficiently? We know that doing full randomized controlled trials can be really difficult and costly in many of these settings. So are there simpler ways that we can do that? That feels like a really promising area. And another element that George mentioned in his introduction was the way that the Sierra Leone Education Innovation Challenge has been structured actually has always applied a price cap, which should then mean that in the longer term, it's more achievable for a government to come on and continue the interventions that are being delivered through the Outcomes Fund, because they have been designed to be affordable. So that's all about how can we scale these structures. I think another important area to think about when we're discussing longer term sustainability is systems level change. and this has come up already, I think, in both George and Anushree's answers. So again, as an outcomes funder, we're really keen to be working in partnership with governments, and that partnership can take many different forms. It's great when host country governments can be co-outcomes funders within these structures. Equally, as Anushree mentioned, that's not always possible for various reasons. So whether governments can be involved in the coordination or involved in another way, we see that as a really important factor in creating that systems level change, ensuring that the learning that is generated through the outcomes fund structure can be embedded in ministries and systems longer term, and also to ensure that from the outset that these outcomes funds are designed and applied in a way that is consistent with longer term strategies for the sector wherever they're operating in. And the final piece of the puzzle that we're really interested in when we're thinking about sustainability and scaling is the role of investors. And the experiences that we've had so far have shown that active investors can be hugely powerful in helping delivery organizations to become results oriented, again, as George mentioned at the start. And I think it's fair to say that until now, there's been a fairly small group of investors that fit this niche and are willing to be involved in these structures. We would love to see that group of investors grow and to see continued partnership between investors who are willing to come not just with working capital, but the ability to work really closely with delivery partners and create that change towards becoming more results oriented. I think my final comment on this is in all of this, I think what we've realized as an outcomes funder is outcomes-based financing is a really flexible way of working, and it can be applied in many different ways in different contexts. And that's really the key here to using outcomes-based financing and really creating sustainable impact is thinking about how to use the structure in a way that is going to work in a specific context with the specific objectives that you have in mind. And then really the sky's the limit.
Great, thanks a lot. So we're getting a lot of questions on the Q&A, but before we go there, I have one quick question. Intended originally for all of you, but if we can keep it brief, each of you, what comes to mind first, so that we can move towards the questions that we have in the Q&A. So what do you think are the success factors specifically for implementing partners to succeed in this type of mechanisms? And from your different perspectives, Jemima's perspective, what are you looking for? George, what you've seen in your own journey, and same as Anushree when working with different organizations. So I'll start with George.
Yeah, thank you, Juanita. I think one success factor for implementing partners, really, one has to do with when partners have greater autonomy to really respond to the needs and cause they have the opportunity to correct where necessary. Remember, I did mention that the contextual realities were not revealed to us until when we started intervention. So, for example, we are reaching out to EOF very often to see how we can divert some money or resources or budget line for certain activities. For example, we realized that printing of student workbook, because we only stopped up pedagogy, and we had that flexibility. So to spending money exactly where we think we can have the biggest impact. And also training, we also see how we are able to divert that to see that when we have district-wise training, we have more individualized attention and support at a school-based training. So there was that flexibility was one good thing that helped lively enough. And the other one is collaborative sharing of learnings. I remember that we are faced with this teacher challenge regarding community and volunteer teachers. And so we learned from our other partners, Save the Children, and the Rise Academy, and all that, how they have really handling their issues. So that helped us to be able to replicate that based on that learnings as such. And also, the Ministry of Education Open Sustainability Partnership. I think that's mentioned clearly that the intention of this program is to be scaled up. So we are more motivated that as we are seeing impact, we also want to be part of the sustainability in terms of how we can scale our initiative to the national level. I think those are just a few key things I can share regarding that one. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, George. Over to you, Anushree.
Thanks. Juanita, would it be okay if I quickly share my screen for a second? No, well, leave it. I think it'll require some tech this. I wanted to actually just show an image. It could have been faster, but basically, I think last year, I mean, we've been working in this for some time, and part of our work is to kind of build a market as well. And last year, we developed an outcome readiness framework and a self-assessment tool for nonprofits, specifically in India, working in education and employment. And we've kind of realized that there are three components, right? So we did extensive consultations, research, etc. And we zeroed down on what is business as usual and what are the the additional, the more, the different competencies that nonprofits need to succeed in any outcome-based financing tool, not just an impact bond. And we came up with the answer. The answer basically was that there are three components. So imagine that this is like some sort of a jigsaw puzzle. Right at the heart of it is the intangible sort of culture, right? So a lot of success factors related to a nonprofit's performance in OBF is actually to do with an outcomes culture, which we think of as a culture that promotes learning and development, a culture that basically promotes high performance, and a culture that promotes innovation. Right. So that's at the heart of it. And I mean, you can use, there's a link in the chat. People can look at the video. I'm not going to go into the details. So that was the intangible aspect of success. And then you have the two tangibles sort of interlocking with each other. On one side, you just have organizational systems and processes. Now, any sound, strong, established, well-performing nonprofit or a non-state actor would require these systems and processes, right? So it includes everything from governance, HR, finance, leadership, etc. What we were able to do is we were able to highlight 5 of these functions where you need to do a little bit more. Right? So we call these the plus plus. Quick example is, all of us are used to stakeholder management. But when you start working in multi-stakeholder OBF projects, you are also working towards building that consensus on the exact same outcomes, exact same targets, exact same way of measuring these outcomes, right? So it's stakeholder engagement, but with a slightly different flavor. And so on the organizational systems and processes, we've highlighted these plus. And this third part of this puzzle is your programmatic maturity, right? Because OBF requires you as a nonprofit to have, of course, the confidence that you're going to be able to deliver on the outcomes, right? So what are the plus competencies? Whether it's monitoring and evaluation on steroids, whether it is evidence that this intervention or an intervention like this could work in this context and it has delivered results in the past. So the evidence around this, right? Or it could be understanding the link between cost and outcomes. And I saw Emily on this call earlier, and I know they've done some fantastic work in ECCE trying to bridge this gap, right? And so just trying to highlight what more is required. And this is based on our experience and, based on the work we've been doing and consultations with others. So I feel like it's very specific to the Indian context, but it could also, some aspects of it could also apply to others. So I'm going to stop there, Juanita, in the interest of time. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Anushree. Very interesting. And then, yeah, quickly, Jemima, in 1 minute, what is a donor you're looking for implementing partners?
Sure. Everything's been mentioned already, really. So I'm just going to mention one additional point, which we've seen in Sierra Leone has really been impactful, is delivery partners that can work and be fully embedded in local communities and really get the involvement of caregivers and local community networks and organizations as part of what they're doing. And that's been transformational.
Great. Thanks a lot. So yeah, going back to you, Jemima, there's a question on the Q&A. Yeah, they're saying they're really curious about what you think the future is for OBF in such a rapidly shifting funding environment. Bilateral funders and national governments have been such an important source of outcomes funding. Do you think they will be able to continue playing that role with the rise of more aid, a skeptic government in the West, and the debt crisis in Africa?
Yeah, great question. And it's a very challenging environment. We have to be honest about that. And while we have, in the programs that we're involved in already, while we have tried to build resilience, for example, through including the cost cap that George mentioned in Sierra Leone, we are constantly alive to the risk that just the sheer fact of budget constraints, both on the domestic government side and the donor government side, will make it challenging to kind of scale these up in the easy way, I guess, of just taking an existing structure that works and pumping more funding into it. We're very alive to the fact that that's unlikely to be straightforward. However, I think there are three things here really. Firstly, as FCDO, through our ecosystem building work, we are really trying to work with partners across the spectrum to get them to understand the outcome-based approach and to create a pipeline of new funders who would be willing to step in. For example, the multilateral development banks. The World Bank is closely involved in the Education Outcomes Fund in Ghana, and we're seeing more interest from others as well, both global and regional development banks. Secondly, the point about systems level learning becomes even more important if in this cost constrained environment, budget constrained environment, even if a program isn't able to scale through drawing in additional outcomes funding, if it's been designed in the right way with systems level learning at its core, then there will still be benefits that can be continued afterwards. Perhaps a shift in understanding of a particular learning methodology. And then finally, I would say, one important thing here is that even in a budget constrained environment, I think outcomes-based financing structures are really compelling because kind of by their nature, their value for money, because the outcomes funder is only paying for the outcomes. They're not paying for inputs that actually don't create the change that we want to see. And they're sharing the risk. If there are social investors involved, they're sharing that risk with social investors. So we think it's already a compelling argument. The analysis that's going on in the community at the moment on value for money will make that an even more compelling argument. So it's really critical that we can generate that evidence on value for money as well. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thanks a lot, Jemima. And you've touched upon a bit on the investor role in this answer, but also previously as well. And there's also a few questions on the Q&A about sort of like the difference and the value add of an investor and how this can shift the dynamic between having one or not. So yeah, Anushree, would love to get your insights on that, of what does investor bring to the table and how not having it or having it can change sort of the set of incentives.
Okay, I'll quickly attempt an answer, but then I'd also request Jemima to come in. I know she has extensive experience. So I mean, look, the idea of having an investor is that they bear the risk, right? So they give you the upfront working capital that an implementation partner needs to execute, the intervention or the program. Without having to worry about where the money is going to come from, quarterly tranches, inputs, etc. And the investor bears the risk or any kind of risk in terms of outcomes not being met or underachieved, right? So the cover that you get, the flexibility that you get with upfront money, almost the cover that you get from the investor, which allows you therefore the freedom to, innovate, implement, do what you want to do in a way that kind of works the best for the community and the outcome without having to worry about budget allocations, line items moving, etc. Gives you that very precious flexibility that an implementation partner will need in execution, right? So that's number one, that it gives you the space to be flexible, to innovate, and to do what you do the best, which is to implement the interventions. Second, it takes away that fear of loss because, like I said, in most structures, the investor will bear the loss. You, of course, have risk and return sharing with implementation partners, but at least in a space like FLN, we see that the investors are kind of bearing the loss. The third thing, which I think is not spoken about, or which is actually recognized in the OBF ecosystem, is the performance management help. So the investor typically would come in with help and support on managing performance, which is helping you achieve the targets that you've set out. This is either done in-house, it's done through an expert agency externally. But that is the magic sauce, because that is the kind of almost help, hand-holding, mentorship that our education partners have found the most helpful, because you're looking at data real time, you're thinking of how do I use this data to improve, what should I change so that my outcomes are better, what should I avoid, is it even making sense from a cost perspective? So the performance management function or help that an investor provides is actually at most times invaluable to education partners. And I saw a question on how do you measure if the organization itself has evolved? And I don't know if there are frameworks, but I can tell you from experience, a lot of the education partners or implementation partners who participated in these transactions have attributed their growth, even at an org level, to that performance management function. So, yeah. I just want to say that there are structures that work without investors, like your very typical sort of RBF or pay for results contract. But I think the usage of those are in a slightly different context, and there are pros and cons to that. So, yeah.
Great, thanks, Anushree. And yeah, also related to this performance management point, I wanted to ask one last question to George about, are there any practical tips for other implementing partners that they undergo in this process of how to do this sort of change of mindset that you've talked about? Anything in particular, like any tool or anything practical that has been particularly helpful for NEF?
Excuse me, sorry, I got it broken.
Has there been any, do you have any practical advice in terms of how to do that change of mindset from activities to outcomes? How has NEF overcome that journey?
Well, yeah, practically, I think, as I remember, I shared that we being a local-led organization, really, it's very helpful in the outcome because the way we are now placed, based on the little impact we have been able to play collaboratively, it's very critical that the mindset shift that we can really do with collective effort and big strategy. That is a bit loose, but we are thinking that maybe a small organization, how can we stand the chance of maybe creating impact? And I'm happy to share that somebody asked a question in the group whether we are able to meet the threshold. We have not had any challenge in terms like this year too. We had 103%, so we exceeded our threshold of 100%. And so it's actually a great opportunity for us, partners working in such a program like that, to be a bit more strategic. And when once is propelled by the result that we want to see, And because the challenges we have in the field are so many. But however, we are pushed to see how we can manage at that level. And so with collective effort, I think partners will change their mind in terms of how they can really work together to be able to change the impact I want to create. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Well, we're at time. I wish we had a lot more time because there's a lot of interesting insights coming from everyone. But thanks a lot, everyone, for joining. It's definitely been very interesting conversation. Learn a lot, I think. Something that I take away with is what you said, Anushree, on trusting, on building trust in these mechanisms beyond achieving outcomes. And all the different things that you, Jemima, talked about, how to scale, how to bring it, how to put the mind in cost effectiveness. And then, of course, all the insights from George on how to embark in this journey as an implementing partner and really take advantage and be more strategic in how you implement your interventions. So thank you, everyone. Very interesting, and look forward to continue the conversation, hopefully in other forums later on.